Greetings everyone, I'm Prince B. Now, it's no secret, I love me some Zelda, and with Breath of the Wild coming up next year, I'm in the mood to talk about it more than ever. Today, I want to discuss one of the most memorable aspects of the franchise. All the hours of adventuring and questing lead up to this, the dungeon. Filled with powerful foes and tough puzzles, it's hard to talk about the Zelda experience without covering dungeons. Specifically for this video, we'll be covering my top 10 favorite Zelda dungeons, and why they make the list, whether it be the puzzles, the atmosphere, or just the raw challenge. Number 10. Hyrule Castle from A Link to the Past. Now, I'm not much of a sucker for nostalgia, at least not as much as a lot of people, but when I hear that iconic music, I know it's time to beat some baddies, save the princess, and set out on a grand adventure. Now, I know what you're thinking, Prince B, this isn't really a dungeon. Well, it has a map, big key, dungeon item, and boss. So yeah, I'd say it does qualify as a dungeon, at least as much as, if not more so, than other mini dungeons like the bottom of the well in Ocarina of Time. While it's fairly simple and straightforward, just getting you acclimated to the game, it's still incredibly memorable as your first trial, your first challenge, and it's one of the few dungeons you actually return to at a later point in your adventure, serving as a great way of measuring just how much you've grown. Highlighting your mastery and growth in the game is one of the most important aspects of a dungeon, and Hyrule Castle certainly fits the bill. Number 9. At number 9 is the Fortress of Winds from the Minish Cap, not to be confused with the similarly named Palace of Winds from the same game. This one comes first, and despite its name, has absolutely nothing to do with wind. Confused yet? Instead, the main theme of this dungeon is using the dungeon item, the mole mitts, to dig through mounds of dirt that have filled the ruins, locating treasure and opening up new paths. It's admittedly kind of tedious, but there's just something satisfying about seeing a fully cleared room. Ruin Restoration Project 2005. While the dungeon itself isn't terribly difficult, just time-consuming, it's always been the one I've looked forward to most when replaying Minish Cap. Perhaps it's the very contradictory nature of a wind temple with no wind, having fallen into such disrepair that you could get away with calling it an earth temple. Or maybe it's just the fact it calls to my perfectionist nature. Either way, I have whole heaps of fun every time I do this dungeon. Can you dig it? Number 8. Maybe it's just me, but I always found it super, convenient that the item you need to beat a dungeon is just found sitting there in said dungeon. Like, if all the bosses just got together and traded the items around, Link wouldn't really be able to do much. Or at the very least, he'd have to do a lot of backtracking. Okay, so I can't get through the Forest Temple without a bow, but all they gave me were these hover boots, so now I have to go to the Shadow Temple to get the long shot, and then go to the Water Temple and get the hammer, now over to the Fire Temple where I can get the bow, and then circle back to finish the second half of the Forest Temple. Yeah, I get that would be super messy for actual gameplay reasons. Lots of backtracking and remembering what you needed for where, it'd all just be super frustrating. I always thought the concept would be neat all the same. But then, they actually did kind of experiment with the idea of not being able to clear a dungeon all in one sitting, with the Temple of the Ocean King from Phantom Hourglass. This dungeon is the main dungeon of the game, and is unique for a lot of reasons. First is that whole having to revisit it thing. You don't really get any new items in this dungeon. Instead, you get access to other parts of the map with their own dungeons, which have items you can bring back to help you delve further into the main dungeon. This means that until the end, you're never seeing the dungeon in its entirety, just a little more each time. It's also a timed dungeon. You can only stay in it for so long before the temple's curse drains away your life force. This, combined with the fact its resident enemy, the Phantom, is unkillable for the majority of the game, makes it a much more tense experience than you get from most Zelda games, turning the normal formula of rush through beating every enemy in your path and solving the occasional puzzle into a much slower and stealth-based operation, where you have to plan out your routes and where combat takes a backseat to puzzle solving. It's incredibly unique and really shakes up the typical dungeon exploring formula. While some argue it was a change for the worst, I happen to enjoy it quite a bit for what it tried to accomplish. While I wouldn't say it's the way Zelda needed to go from that point on, and am honestly glad it returned to the more standard formula for most of its later games. It was nice to see something a little different. Number 7. The last dungeon of a game is typically meant to showcase how you've grown over the course of your journey, provide a playground for you to test all the skills in your arsenal. Stone Tower Temple from Majora's Mask does a great job of this, having various parts where you need to incorporate all of your transformation masks and Link's normal arsenal. Add in Majora's Mask's ever-present time limit, and it can be quite a challenge. Further, the bizarre layout of the dungeon fits the overall mood of the game perfectly. It's a stark contrast to the very cohesive designs of the previous 3 dungeons, yet it's the lack of cohesion here that makes Stone Tower so effective. It takes everything you think you know about dungeons and literally turns it on its head. Just as Majora's Mask is not your typical Zelda game, Stone Tower is not your typical dungeon. It fits right into the bizarre world of Termina by, well, not fitting in. Number 6. Number 6 is also a tower, the Tower of the Gods from Wind Waker. What sticks out most about this dungeon compared to many other dungeons, which tend to be ruins fallen into disrepair, mines, or temples dedicated to worshipping the goddesses or other holy sites for tribes like the Gorons or Rito, is that this is a dungeon designed by the goddesses specifically for testing the mettle of a would-be hero. Thusly, all the puzzles seem specifically engineered to your capabilities. Everything feels deliberate compared to other parts of the game. Further, the atmosphere is wonderful here, from the ancient feel of the general design to the fact you start at sea level and gradually move up, making you feel like you're slowly rising to the challenge put before you by the goddesses themselves. While not a particularly difficult dungeon, it's a great example of how a dungeon is presented can be all you need to carry you through. Number 5. One of the coolest dungeons in Zelda is actually not very cool at all, by which I mean it's very hot, because it's in the middle of a volcano. Yeah, that's right, the Fire Temple from Ocarina of Time. There's a lot to love here. First, it's big, with lots of areas to explore. Second, you're not just trying to reach the end and beat down a big baddie, you're here to rescue your adopted Goron brethren and save your sworn brother Darunia. This always gave this particular dungeon a lot more weight than the others. This time, it's personal. And it's not enough that they're kidnapped, no, that'd be too easy. The Fire Temple took it up a notch and has them all lined up to be sacrifices to a giant dragon. That's pretty intense. Speaking of, the boss for this temple is one of the cooler bosses in the series, though that's another list for another time. Finally, the reward for all your efforts is the knowledge you've saved the Goron race. How great is that? Yeah, okay, no, the real reward is this really sweet hammer. Number 4. At number 4 is the Arbiter's Grounds from Twilight Princess. Being a weird combination of a creepy crypt, a desert level, and even a little homage to Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple Ghost Hunt, it's definitely memorable to say the least. And while it may not be as blatantly creepy as the Shadow Temple or even the bottom of the well from the aforementioned Ocarina of Time, where acts of torture took place, this former prison still has a certain unsettling atmosphere. The legions of the undead certainly don't help matters, with Stalfos, Poes, Redeads, and Ghost Rats all after you. This dungeon is where the already above-averagely hard for a Zelda game Twilight Princess kicks it up a notch, so it's no slouch in the difficulty department either. And with one of the most unique items in the series and a very memorable boss fight, it's no wonder why the Arbiter's Grounds is a fan favorite. Number 3. Number 3 is the Water Temple from Ocarina of Time. What? Oh, right, this is the part where you're all waiting for me to go, psych, lol, JK, and give my real number 3. Well, that's not happening, cause I actually really like the Water Temple. Boo! Okay, I get it. The Water Temple is infamous for being hard, often cited as one of, if not the hardest dungeons in all of Zelda, usually tied with, oddly enough, the other water-themed dungeons Great Bay Temple from Majora's Mask and the Lake Bed Temple from Twilight Princess. What's up with Zelda and hard water temples? Anyway, while people complain about the Water Temple being hard, I never actually found it to be that confusing. and further, I never understood why it being hard is such a bad thing. In fact, a common complaint about the Zelda franchise, or at least some of the newer games, is that the dungeons tend to be a bit on the easy side. It's a little challenging, sure, but a little challenge never hurt anyone. Well, I mean, it hurt Link, but it's okay, I got a fairy. Who even cares? But seriously, I love the water temple because it does give a bit more challenge, and the concept of constantly raising and lowering the water levels is super cool. While it's been messed around with in various other Zeldas, usually it's just a one-way street. Add some water, swim to the next part. But this one requires you to add more water and drain it to access new parts of the dungeon, making it feel much more involved than just flicking a switch and being on your merry way. Add in a hauntingly beautiful atmosphere, and what can I say? I'm hooked! Okay, that was bad, but I really do love the water temple. Put it on a shirt for all I care. What can I say? I have fun here. Number 2. Snow Peak Ruins from Twilight Princess is a dungeon that's fairly unique in that it barely feels like a dungeon at all. It's an isolated mountaintop mansion that serves as the home of the loving Yeti couple, Yeto and Yetta. Aw, they're adorable. This is another dungeon that plays with the formula a bit. Instead of beating the mansion's inhabitants to take your quest item of the day, they're all too happy to just give it to you. If only Yetta could remember where she put it. Naturally, it's up to you to scour the mansion as she sends you to places she thinks she may have put it. Of course, nothing's ever simple, and instead you end up with a plethora of ingredients for the soup Yeto's making. As you bring him more ingredients, the soup's restorative properties increase, saving you trips down the mountain to replenish your potions. Eventually you find your quest item, but oh no, it's the old bait and switch! You end up beating the mansion's inhabitants and taking your quest item anyway. Oh well. Actually, everything works out in the end, so that's good. Obviously, everything about Snow Peak is super unique, and it's just a lot of fun to explore the snowy ruins. Number 1. Remember how I talked about how weird it was that you always just so happen to find the required item in any given dungeon? Well, that's part of why I love A Link Between Worlds, where all your items are rentals, and thus you can tackle dungeons in any order you like. In addition, many of the dungeons are throwbacks to classic dungeons from A Link to the Past. Of all the dungeons in A Link Between Worlds, my favorite is perhaps one of the simplest, the Thieves' Hideout. Being an obvious counterpart to the Thieves' Hideout from Link to the Past, it takes a lot of cues from its predecessor, which eased back on your need for a specific dungeon item to maneuver and instead focused more on exploration, finding an NPC, and escorting them to a goal. This version is similar, but instead of barely needing an item to traverse the dungeon, here you don't need anything but your wits. Technically you do need bombs, but there are enemies you can use as bombs right next to all areas that you need them for, making it a non-issue. It really gives you a break from the standard dungeon formula of spamming one item for the whole dungeon and then promptly forgetting you have it. I like it a lot, and while it has a lot of nods to the Thieves' Hideout of old, it still manages to pack in some new twists and does a great job of standing on its own. With so many dungeons across so many games, it was hard to narrow it down to just these 10. There were several that just barely didn't make the cut. What dungeons do you most enjoy or remember? Tell me in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching.